everybody. Welcome to Resi Live. It is another Tuesday, and I am so excited because for the first time, I feel like I'm like towering over you guys right now, but we have three people in the studio, so we're
making it work. We're making it work.
Making it
It's
work.
going to be good.
Yeah, that's awesome. No, but I'm here with Daniel Larson from Resi.
Hey, what's up, guys?
Once again, and today in studio, just like I mentioned, we are very blessed to have Mr. Matt Engel joining us. And Matt is the leader of innovation at Gloo up in Boulder, Colorado, which is probably one of the coolest company names or coolest organization names.
It's exaggerated.
And I really need to know. I guess too, I've never asked how that name came about, and maybe I don't know if anybody knows.
Long story
Yeah,
short.
anyway, so you do that. You were also a former pastor down in Phoenix, Arizona.
That's right.
One of the largest growing or fastest growing churches in the nation.
Yep.
We're just really excited to have you today to just talk about engagement. That's really the focus, the word, kind of the buzzword, the keyword. A lot of churches are talking about it, so we want to go over a little bit about what it means and how it affects churches. But first of all, can you just tell us a little bit about what you do, and tell me just a little bit about what innovation at Gloo looks like?
Yeah. Super good to be with you guys. I
Absolutely.
love what you guys are doing here. So at Gloo on the innovation side, I work with we call them lighthouse churches. They're about 120 churches, some of the most influential churches in the world, but then some churches you've probably never heard of, but are bent toward innovation. So we're focused on figuring out things that aren't yet reality versus kind of copying the same thing over and over, expecting a different result. Our group of churches are literally like kind of pioneering, and what I like to say, and I stole this from one of our friend churches down in San Diego, painted a lot of dumb tax so that hopefully the rest of the churches don't have to pay that same dumb tax.
Sure.
But if we can uncover what actually means to help our people grow, especially in this new paradigm with everything, that's what these guys are bent towards. So it's a lot of experimentation. It's a lot of failing fast. But most importantly, it's like, we've just learned this thing. We've now had 20 churches run this same thing, and it seems to be holding true as far as a pattern goes. Let's now share that with the world so that everybody knows that might be a new norm that could actually come to fruition to help them advance the kingdom of God. So awesome. We're super blessed and fortunate to have the company that we have with churches that are focused on that sort of the side of innovation versus, hey, just tell us what we need to do and we'll go ahead and go do it. It's like, that's great, and that works for a lot. But these churches are focused on what is to come. So it's pretty cool.
That's awesome. So on that topic then, obviously you guys focus a lot on this idea of engagement. And what does that look like? How are churches doing in that, kind of arena of, before it was attendance, now it's engagement. What does that kind of look like? And what does engagement look like to you, especially in that like small group of churches that you guys are pioneering with?
Yeah, so one of the things that engagement has been around for a little bit. Even pre-COVID, it was kind of an up-and-coming buzzword. We don't measure attendance, we measure engagement. But in all reality, it was always still about the 4 Bs, butts, budgets, baptisms, and buildings. And that was the functional thing for engagement. It was just a sexier term to say engagement.
Sure.
One of the things that COVID brought to us that finally helped reconcile some of this language together was that, post-COVID, I don't like definitives, so I'll say the majority of churches, right after COVID hit was like, hey, remember, the people are the church, not the building, so we care about the people and we're going to be fine. And they started substituting attendance for engagement, but they really still meant attendance because that was the only thing that they've ever been brought up in as far as counting. Well, engagement to me is organizational centric. And I'm going to go back to what every other leader had said and what we had communicated, even at my church when we were communicating. It was like, remember, the people are the church, not the building. Well, so if that holds true and engagement is org-centric, then what is person-centric? Because that's what we should care about. And we've started seeing this term bubble up called involvement. So what does it look like from an involvement perspective? Because, Nate being involved in ministry versus you is still very different. engagement is org-centric, which means like, I want you to do my thing at my time, and it doesn't count if it doesn't count within the context of my thing as the organization.
Wow, yeah.
But organizations don't grow people, people grow people. So I need to actually begin to move that dial down one dimension further that says, no, I actually care about what Nate's involved in, because that's what matters most. And my job as the organization is to equip Nate to do the work of the ministry, which is biblical, equip the saints to do the work of the ministry, which has always been the case. But somehow we substituted the saint as the organization. Organizations don't grow people, people grow people.
Right.
So that's the whole dynamic that's begun to evolve here a little bit in that construct of like, no, people grow people, organizations help support and enable, or that's a non-church word, and people, and especially all the counselors that are listening now are like, he said enable. No, fine, let me churchify it. It's equip the people to help grow people. And so that's the key metric right now that we should be anchored into. I really don't care about the fact that you sent 300,000 emails to 300,000 people. I care about people that actually grabbed that thing and did something with it to help somebody else grow. So that's the big shift.
So it sounds like what we're trying to do here is measure Nate's involvement in his church.
Exactly.
Okay. Cool.
Exactly. Which right now, slim to none. No.
I got a 1-year-old who's constantly sick. So, Matt, what is this path? What does this look like when you're starting to work with churches who are very engagement focused and focused on attendance, and just like you're saying, the 3 Bs?
Yep.
How do we begin shifting that framework from a goal of engagement and attendance to a goal of involvement?
Yeah, I think what I'm starting to see right now is just this shift in really the leader, the lead team, the executive, whatever you want to call that decision-making group, being okay with the idea that, man, the number of butts in seats or butts on a couch actually don't matter. It's, are they actually helping advance the ministry? And that's sort of this tension right now of like, hey, before COVID, you might have been whatever your 100% was. What I'm seeing right now is that new 100% is like 70 to 80% of what used to be. Well, that's your new 100% now. And that should be okay. So there's a level of humility that's required that says, man, my job is not to necessarily fill the room or fill the couch. My job is to equip the saint to do the work of the ministry. And so there's this big tension right now of some of these other churches, some of these larger churches, you might say, that are looking around the room going like, wow, we're only at 65, 70% capacity than what we were. Somehow I'm inferior. It's like, no, actually, my job is still to equip them to do the work of the ministry. And if that means that they go out and share the gospel with 10 other people, we win. And now we're 150% of where we were pre-COVID versus just the 100% of filling butts in the seats. So that's this unique dynamic. And it really requires that top layer to kind of start to embrace the idea. It's like, I probably banked too much on who was in the room and who was consuming versus who is actually contributing to the mission that the Lord's placed on their heart. And so this whole concept of consumption over contribution, that was always wrong. It's always been biblical to be like contribute value over consumption. And that's the big shift that we're seeing, regardless of modality. Again, if you show up in church, that's great. If you choose to stream online, that's great too. Like, the end user or the congregant or the community member in this perspective is making the decision. Modality shouldn't matter. The outcome of the modality should matter. And that's what we should be measuring.
So this is interesting to me because it sounds like what you're trying to say is if you're ministering to the people that are already at your church, that will actually fuel growth for people that are not at your church.
Right.
Versus the other way around, where it's like we just need to reach more people so that they show up and then like become part of our church.
That's right.
And so how do you balance that in an organization when that seems like more of a longer play?
It is.
So what would you kind of advise someone, in a leadership role to prepare for when it comes to kind of making this shift?
Yeah, the biggest gap that we have right now is we were banking on the idea that I created a great sermon And I pretty much, but I didn't create it. It was always been the case. It's like, I want you to serve, I want you to give, I want you to be in a group. And somehow those three things were like the hallmark of being a good Christian. And I'm like, I know a ton of people that attended every Sunday, were in a group that gave and were serving, that were terrible Christians. It's like, how do I want to replicate that motion versus the other motion? And so this whole idea from what I've seen from my perspective is like, how do we begin to provide better tools for our people to actually do ministry? Wow. Not necessarily, how do we get more of my people to bring their friend to hear me pontificate for 29 minutes around a 3-minute Bible verse? Right? Like, right. That's not what's actually growing people. People grow people, and we should be in the business, I hate to use that term, but in the business of providing better tools for Nate to help you grow in your relationship with Nate and then grow in your relationship ultimately with the Lord. Versus, man, you do not want to miss this sermon. I don't know what it's going to be about, but you should show up.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, you really don't want to miss next week. It's going to be amazing. Yeah. Versus like, hey, let me give you a tool that helps you better love your spouse or better love your kids. And when I help you do that thing, I innately, if I'm Nate, have developed trust and relationship with you that ultimately allows Nate to speak into you and say, hey, you know what, we're going to be going through a parenting series coming up, and I think it would just be good for you. Like, based upon what I see that you're pouring into your kids, this would be wise. Wow. You now trust and have a relationship with him in which the church is more adequate for your own growth versus this idea of like, hey, my pastor told me, in this instance, Nate, to tell you, you should come to church. Oh, okay. Maybe.
This sounds a lot like disciples making disciples versus disciples inviting someone else to do the work for them.
That's right. It's like, how can I outsource to my lead pastor the ability for Nate to help you, become a disciple, when it's like, that's not the pastor's job.
Sure.
The pastor and the church again, the organization should be focused relentlessly on equipping Nate to do the work of the ministry. And that doesn't mean you have to show up to a building. That literally mean, again, back in the day, remember when we used to put music on cassette tapes and we'd give them all to all the people and they would pop it in and carpool in. And the hope and desire was, you would strike up a conversation and be like, wow, this is great music. Oh, this is our church band. You should show up. And then we went to the CD, and now we never replaced the CD on that construct. Well, we need to be focused on providing better tools for our heroes in the story, which is not the church and it's not the staff. It's literally the laity and the what I consider the latent energy that exists in every single church's pew that honestly the church has just done a really bad job at unlocking. Because we basically have started hiring the pastors to be like, hey, you develop them. I don't need to.
Right.
I brought them here.
Yep.
It's like, that's not the role of the job of the pastor or the church.
Sure.
I want to piggyback a little bit off of, we've talked about change and we've talked about how, I want to touch on a phrase that I think strikes a nerve with you, the new normal. Right. A lot has changed in the past year. And what does that look like? What are you saying to churches right now and to church leaders that are nervous about the changes that are happening?
Yeah, I don't like the new normal term. I think it's blown way out of proportion. I actually think it gives us an excuse to opt out of like our due diligence and our job. So I actually think this evolving shift brings us actually back pre the Industrial Revolution, which was always focused on people helping people. It was never about this monolithic pipeline called X church that, based upon their size and scale, must have meant they were good, so therefore everybody went to them. It's like pre that era, it was always about the local body helping other people in the local context bump into their own desires to say, I can be better. And you have something I don't, therefore I want to know what you have. And I have this relationship with Jesus. Yeah. It began in the Industrial Revolution to be outsourced to the local brand of the church. And it was like, hey, the bigger the marquee sign and the more billboards you have, that must be that you're legit, so I might show up to that thing. So this idea from this new normal perspective is really focused on this more emotion that trust now no longer relies upon the biggest brand and the biggest persona and the biggest communicator. It really relies upon 100,000 strangers saying, hey, that's a safe place for people to actually bump into some help.
Yeah.
Wow.
And once we actually bump into that thing, chances are the long play, to your point, Dana, is like, hey, I might actually bump into Jesus, and I'm okay with that long play versus like, let me beat you over the head with the Bible. I mean, I remember growing up in a premillennial fundamentalist King James Version only Baptist church, and it was like, nope, you have to believe Scripture before you belong in this church. And it was like, that was never true. Like Jesus wasn't like walking around the people and being like, believe in me and then we'll chat. He was always like, no, hey, let's bump into each other. Let's have a conversation. You can belong to me before you actually believe in me. Right? So there's this tension that we're actually seeing, this evolution. And I think we're getting back to the actual roots of the church in Acts of like, this is how the church actually expanded.
Yeah.
Beyond what we wanted to manufacture, because that was the normal and the economic model that most of our church leaders have been brought up in. It was the Industrial Revolution, supply, demand, build a bigger pipe.
Sure. Yeah.
Wow. Okay, so a lot of this, bumping into happens, in a physical context.
Yep.
There's a person and then another person, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, okay, you have what I think I want. What is that? But what happens when you throw in the digital equation? How does that like actually happen, and how can we do it well?
Yeah. So in my observation, what I've seen is, look, digital is a means, it's a modality that should support the face-to-face interaction. The primacy of growth, so the fundamental way that we grow the best is face-to-face. And Nate kicked it off. Wow, the three of us are in a room and we're having a conversation.
Right.
We could do this by Zoom, and we could hire an outsourced thing to help facilitate a conversation. And we've done that before with some of our other webinars. But the fundamental idea is that we grow better and the best in this face-to-face interaction. I could hire a text message, which I do regularly with a handful of my mentors and with a handful of mentees that I'm supporting. And I hire this SMS capability to fit into the gap of my face-to-face encounter. So digital is super important in that, but it needs its right place, which means digital supports the actual face-to-face encounter. And I can go months, I can go a year, I can go 2 years, I can go years without ever seeing the person that I want to. But man, when you put me in a room with that person and we've leveraged digital in that gap between our face-to-face experience, we grow 1,000 times better.
Wow.
So in the same context of a church hiring a digital platform to support their people, it's like ultimately we need to help those people get into the context of a face-to-face experience, because that's what our job is for. I mean, fundamentally, the church is designed to help facilitate growth, aka help people bump into Jesus and make disciples.
Yeah.
So fundamentally, I can do that. I want to do that as the sort of the most effective way.
Right.
It's going to be face-to-face. But that might mean a supplemental gap tool, in this instance, digital experience, to help enable that thing to happen.
Yeah.
Wow. That's huge.
Yeah. So one question kind of on that I want to hit on. I think a lot of pastors and church leaders are kind of scared about what happens in this gap. Do I lose people? Do I lose giving? Do I lose engagement and involvement?
Yep.
How do you encourage the best use of digital platforms in order to live alongside and fill in the gaps, but in a way that is still fostering that involvement in a way that is the closest replication to physical as possible?
Yeah, I think what we need to evaluate really is, where do we hire digital tools? And I use that in the construct of, just really quickly, like if there was a nail in the wall, I could hire my hand to pound that nail in the wall. I could hire a screwdriver to pound that nail in the wall. Or I could hire a hammer to pound that nail in the wall. The most effective tool probably is going to be the hammer. My hand's going to hurt a little bit. I might be able to get it. I could probably bang it long enough and hard enough with the end of a screwdriver that I could get the stupid thing in there. But chances are the hammer's going to be the most effective tool. In this instance, digital is strictly a modality. It's strictly a tool. So how do we leverage a tool across the entire spectrum of what job every church is trying to solve?
Yeah.
And there are specific jobs that every church is trying to solve. So where I leverage a small group, guess what? I can wrap that small group experience with a platform like Facebook Live or Zoom or SMS grouped text or the WhatsApp group function. I'm hiring a capability to help facilitate the group experience, but I'm doing that in the construct of desiring that group experience to actually meet face-to-face at some point. We didn't know what that was when COVID started. We are starting to see visibility into that now that things are opening up. So it's like, now we know people are actually doing that. But I tell you what, just because we meet on Wednesday, how do we support every other day till the next Wednesday?
Mm-hmm.
That's a digital tool, probably.
Right.
So there is this element of like, okay, how do I support the weekend to weekend experience? Well, I probably need to think about hiring digital capabilities that sit into that gap. Otherwise, I'm banking on the fact that, man, I preached one heck of a sermon this weekend. Everybody's coming back next weekend. It's like, chances are you didn't preach that good of a sermon. So the idea here is like, how do we support that gap engagement, because it's org-centric, within the digital tool or digital capability to support it.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about that gap then, because prior to hitting record on this conversation, we were talking about average attendance and how many times someone comes back per month or whatever. So talk us through like some of the opportunities that are really presented, factoring in, the actual amount of time someone actually walks through your door.
Yeah, so we were talking, the research in the mid-2000s was basically 1.7 times a month. The average person was attending in about 2015, 2017, about 1.3 times a month. So it was already going down as far as butts and seats consuming content on a weekend.
Sure.
The interesting part from my perspective was how many prayer requests came in from that individual in between the 1.3 times that they were attending. They were involved in ministry. How many times did they pray for somebody else in that gap? They were involved in ministry. But because we were so organizationally four-walled centric, it didn't quote unquote count.
Right.
Whereas I'm looking at, man, you know what? You shared your testimony with Nate. And you were at church 3 weeks ago and haven't been back since. But you took these small little steps by taking Nate to coffee once a week, getting to know him, building relationship and building trust with him, that opened up the opportunity for him to say like, man, how can you love your spouse when you're like doing all this stuff and she's doing all this stuff and everything else? And you're like, because I know Jesus and my sanctity and salvation is banked in him, not in my spouse.
Sure.
And so it's these other paradigms that actually people have always done, but we were so focused on the four walls of the building, not the people, that our metrics and observations of what actually, quote unquote, growth was org-centric, not person. Jeez. And so if we can get to a spot where we can be like, man, you know what? In order to get people into a small group, we just need them to pray for somebody else 3 times over the next 3 weeks. Mm-hmm. I'll take that pattern all day long versus me standing up on stage on a Sunday preaching about the importance of community and trying to muscle a bunch of people into a group.
Right.
It's like, actually, no, let's lower the bars of entry into ministry, not in a negative sense of like somehow we're diminishing the, our faith in Jesus, but it's like, I shouldn't have to jump over this massive bar of being in a group in order to count.
Right, right.
I actually have the capacity, because I'm a CEO of a large startup in Boulder, Colorado. Yet guess what? I actually have the capacity to lead my people that I work with, and I don't have the time to jump through your Wednesday night hoop in order to count that I'm in a small group, because I'm in multiple small groups across my organization.
Oh, yeah, that's amazing. Okay, so it sounds like you're asking a lot of pastors, a lot of church staff members to put a lot of trust in their people, because I don't know, how do you measure something like that? How do you get the numbers that like make pastors sleep better?
Yeah.
How do you measure something like this where it almost seems very like out of staff members control.
Yeah, I think that's where I'm like, why did we hire that pastor? It's like, I didn't hire that pastor to like feel good. I hired that pastor to equip me to do the work of the ministry, period. So it's like, as a congregant, I'm showing up to church saying, hey, I'm hiring my church to get me into a community and to allow me to contribute value where the Lord's placed that contribution on my heart. I'm not hiring the church. A buddy of mine says this all the time. I'm not hiring the church to recruit me to a chore. Now, there are chores to be done as a family. If we think of the church as a family, there are chores to be done. You know, kids got to be watched, parking lots got to be manned, security's got to be done, all of that stuff. Those are all chores. But my passion is actually like fostering and adopting children. Well, if my church doesn't do that, guess what? I'm going to outsource that passion to somebody else that's going to allow me to do that. So the more that churches can unlock my contributive energy and help build me into a community, then I'm not worried about, as a pastor, that's my core job. How do we help enable contribution and enable community to happen? Wow. And that might actually look different than, hey, in order for it to count, it's got to be a small group. You got to go through our life notes. You got to do this thing. It's got to be on Wednesday at 6:00. And if it's on Friday, God forbid it doesn't count, because that's just a party. That's not actually discipleship. It's like that's never been the case. Yeah. So we need to really kind of anchor in this idea that, yes, if we do a good job of trusting our people, and this is the fundamental paradigm of church right now. Do I have a view of scarcity or abundance? And in my world, it's all about abundance. I view that there are way more Uber drivers out there for ministry than there are people that want to drive a yellow cab. And so overnight, if you look at the Uber example, overnight they unlocked 600,000 people to join their transportation specialist movement. What if every church on the planet did something like that overnight? We wouldn't even know what to do with. And it's already happening. The challenge is we've built up in our mental models that it doesn't count unless we've designed it, own it, and control it. It's like, that's not been the case. So we really need to help our leaders see their job as equipping the saint, and they don't have to own, control, and govern everything. Yeah. That's never been the case.
Wow.
Jesus didn't tell the woman at the well to be like, hey, I want you to go back into town, and this is exactly what I need you to say, and I need you to say it this way, in this tone, in this manner, and use this verb, not that verb, and use this noun and not that noun in order to show people back up to the well. He unlocked her to contribute value to a boatload of people, and she led back to the well. That's a little bit different. That's abundance versus scarcity, saying, man, I don't think she's got it. I think I need to own, control, and govern this way a little bit.
Yeah.
Wow.
So given the tools that we know and the time that we're in as a world and the society that we're in, and specifically when it comes to tools, the digital tools that are available to churches, what would you say is the first step for a church to be able to take this next leap and really honestly be ahead of things?
So the big one, there's probably two right now that I'm like, if you look for involvement, there are two capabilities that are digitally supported that seem to be working at a disproportionate rate. And one, is the QR code. Like, I just think it's amazing that finally those things have come back, even though they were stupid back in the day. Everybody kind of brought them back, and now you can, look at a menu when you go to a restaurant. We have churches that are doing online check-in by QR codes now because they don't want to pass contact. All that stuff is fine and good and everything. So that's one sort of digital thing that seems to be evolving. And again, I'll thank COVID for that. The other one that always seemed to be there that even now has sort of honored our boomers because they've been a little bit more less tech supportive in this regard has been text messaging. It's interesting that people are actually willing to be like, hey, if you give me the right value exchange, I will opt into any anything that you give me, whether it's a web link, whether it's a QR code, whether it's a text message, whether it's an online service, whatever it is, if the value exchange is in their favor, they are willing to do it. And think about it from this perspective. My wife, she just went down to Chick-fil-A and ordered online, ordered through their app. So she's hiring the digital tool that Chick-fil-A has to show up to pick up the sandwiches for our family for that night for dinner. And she goes so far as to even tell them, hey, I'm at the restaurant. Would you be willing to deliver my thing? Right? The value exchange is in her favor in doing that thing. Imagine the church identifying the right value exchange that says, hey, regardless of the capability that we're hiring, whether it's an online service, whatever it is, text message, an email, it could be a freaking postcard for right now. And people are disproportionately opting in if the value exchange is in their favor. And we've just not really thought about it from that perspective. It's always been, we have a chore for you to do and we want everybody to do it. And our metric for success is everyone doing it. If not, somehow we failed. No, our job is to give the willing and able and those that have a desire to dig a hole, a shovel. Mm-hmm. I don't know how far they want to dig. I don't know what size of hole they want to dig. I don't even know what they're digging for. But if I can give them a shovel and those people that grab that shovel start digging, guess what? We're starting to win. And I'm starting to see a pattern. So it's not to say there's better or less than digital capabilities. It's really what shovel are you giving people and who's grabbing that shovel? Your boomers might grab a web link out of an email. Your Gen Xers might show up online, leveraging your online service, communicating and participating and involving themselves in the prayer ministry and the chat. Your millennials might only be engaging in SMS text messaging services. Mm-hmm. I'm okay with all of those.
Yeah.
Because it's the right shovel for the right person versus everybody's got a compliance into one thing.
You got to use this one shovel.
It's like, that shovel doesn't work for what I'm trying to do is plant a vegetable versus dig a freaking tree. I need a backhoe for that.
Yeah.
Right?
I think about, I was just installing sprinklers in my backyard, right? And we were digging these trenches with this, big old garden shovel.
Yep.
My wife says, they make a shovel that's like this thin. It's called a trench shovel.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right. So
finding the right shovel for the right person,
exactly.
The right job,
and that and ultimately think about that person that all they want to do is pray for other people, but they don't want to show up on Monday and touch a bunch of chairs and pray over every chair.
Yeah.
How can we give them the right digital capability, which could literally be a word cloud of the number one prayer request from the week before, and we give them that picture. And they're like, man, I can sit here on my couch and literally all I want to do is pray over the next hour for every prayer request that's come through. But I don't want to show up at church. I don't want to fit into your compliance structure. And then somehow that doesn't count in your regard. Like that's the biggest bogus thing that we've sort of manufactured in church world is that if it doesn't fit our model, it doesn't count.
Yeah. That's so cool.
Wow. Okay. So we've thrown a lot on the table here. And it can be overwhelming. Yeah. Maybe for someone in leadership or someone that wants to affect change in the organization. Where do they start? Like, how do they start to know their people at that level, or start kind of shipping these ideas into public knowledge of, hey, we're gonna pivot. Yeah. And versus being so centric on X, Y, Z. Numbers based, all this different stuff. Not saying the numbers are bad. Nope. But what's like step one?
Yeah. Even to your point, numbers aren't bad. There's an entire book of the Bible called Numbers. So it's like that was probably the
nice pastor's joke.
Yeah. That was the extent of data in seminary for most pastors. It was like, let's read this book. So I think the big thing for people to hear right now is none of this is a hard right or left. Like the Lord's placed on everybody's heart a vision and mission for them to continue to try to lead their people. The goal is to say, hey, 1 or 2 degrees to the right or to the left of what we're doing, and then let's chase that out for 5 years. Because that's literally the difference between hitting the moon and not. And so none of what we've talked about is this massive throw everything out and let's move right. If that's what you've heard, stop listening. That wasn't what the point of this conversation was. It was literally like, hey, how do you begin to slightly move one direction or another based upon the jobs that you're trying to solve? And in this instance, from my perspective, what we should be doing is we should be relentlessly focused on closing feedback loops with our people. And that's a scary thought, because most pastors that I interact with are like, well, Matt, what if they say something that I don't like? Well, they're saying it already. Right? Like, give them an opportunity to share something that says, man, I wouldn't have invited my millennial friend to this sermon because it had no bearing on his life or her life.
Right.
But if I would have known, hey, in 3 months, you're going to be preaching on this, and I know them better than the church does because I'm in relationship with them, guess what I'm going to do? I'm going to invite them to that thing versus the thing that you pressured me into. So this whole idea of how do we create, in what I'm calling like these innovation hubs, where how can we mobilize our people to provide us good, solid feedback in a timely manner that we can cover some of our blind spots. Hey, you want to get younger as a church? Great. Here's some of our leadership thoughts. Rank these on a scale of 1 to 10 that you think you would actually help involve yourself in ministry.
Wow.
Like that simple step of closing feedback loops versus, Eric Ries talks about in Lean Startup in the Startup Way, there's no smart person in the room. There is only hypotheses that need to be tested on the street. Why are we not embracing that idea of our people allowing them to test stuff in the street and give us feedback to improve whatever it is that we're thinking that we want to do? Like, why do a kid's backpack drive? If you're only going to get 3% of your people to participate, but you could get, 80% if you did this date night thing instead, I'm probably going to go with the date night thing, but I needed the feedback from our people to help us understand, because there's no smart person in the room. There's only a bunch of hypotheses that we need to test. Mm-hmm. So if we can get churches in that incremental thing of 1 or 2 degrees to the right or to the left to help protect our blind spots, and acknowledge that just because you're on staff or just because you're a key leader or the lead pastor doesn't mean you know everything.
Yeah.
Embrace humility and acknowledge the fact that our people are the saints, and they have great feedback that could come back into the organization as the church that would actually help facilitate their ability to grow other people.
Wow.
That's really good. Well, Matt, it has been a huge honor. I know a lot of times on these, weekly shows, we get really involved in the technical, and so it's really refreshing to have this high level conversation.
Yeah, there wasn't a lot of API talk.
Well, it's been really a pleasure to talk about just the high level strategy of what actually makes a church grow, and these things that, if we don't set those first, if we don't try things just like you're saying, set those hypotheses and roll with them, we're just going to be, chasing our tail.
That's right.
So, if somebody wants to learn more about what you do or engage in other tools that Gloo provides, what's the best way that they're able to do that?
How can they get involved?
Yeah, good job. Good job. I like that. Yep. Engagement, they can figure it out. So, they want to involve themselves in some of the R&D, they can go to the website gloo.us, gloo.us. Cool. And there's a plethora of things that they could connect into and start to iterate against and figure out if this is a good spot for them to bounce around some of the stuff that we're doing. But ultimately, it's how can they empower their people to help other people? And there's digital tools, there's analog tools, but that's the sole job of the church. Equip the saints to do the work of the ministry.
That's awesome.
So
Love it.
Great.
Now, on the next one, we'll definitely find out what Gloo means.
Exactly.
It's a very bolder name.
Exactly.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Matt.
Hey, I
really
appreciate
appreciate it. Thanks, everybody, for watching, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks.